Do you want to know what the best A2 travel enduro on the market is? Then this video is exactly the right thing for you. Online, there's a trend. Certain people, whether they're YouTubers, streamers, influencers, and so on, take certain things on a topic, whether that's, I don't know, weapons in a computer game, or construction methods, or animals, characters, famous people, unknown illnesses, and so on. Every topic, and these things get sorted into ranking lists. S tier is the highest, it is the top rank. A, B, C, D, then always lower. And I thought, let's do that too for once. I was recently at the presentation of the Kawasaki KLE 500, and there were loads of messages. Yeah, what's it like compared with the KTM 390 Adventure R? And how does it behave compared with the new BMW 450 GS and compared with this one and that one? So since I can't just get hold of all the motorcycles that easily, though don't worry, a proper A2 comparison is hopefully going to happen this year as well. But I thought, for all the curious ones who already want to know at the start of the season how things currently stand in this A2 enduro and travel enduro segment that's grown really strongly over the last few years, for all of you, I'm now doing this tier list, this ranking list based on my assessments and my experience. Right up front, this isn't set in stone and it isn't the law. It's my assessment based on how I like to use these A2 travel enduros, or at least how competent I see the bike as being at fulfilling the intended area of use, or not. And with that, enough words, and I'd say we'll jump straight in. Over the last 2 years or so, I've ridden quite a lot of these A2 travel enduros because I'm responsible for travel enduros at 1000 PS. And at the same time, I'm always a strong advocate of the motto, less is more. And the A2 segment is just close to my heart. I've now gathered together the most prominent ones, or the 10A2 enduro machines that I think come to most people's minds when it comes to this segment, and then plus 1 or 2 additional machines you might not immediately think of, but that I've ridden, and that simply form an interesting expansion of the range, so to speak. And yeah, you'll notice it. I've also included the KTM 390 Enduro R and the Suzuki DR-Z4S. They aren't travel enduros, but more dual sport motorcycles. But they were also heavily in the conversation when it came to this A2 segment and the enduros. That's why they're included too. Let's start with something classic, a classic travel enduro, on the market for quite a long time, and yet still, I think, talked about a lot. The CFMOTO 450 MT from the Chinese manufacturer. A 450 engine, a pure twin cylinder that offers enough performance so you can handle long distance, so you can ride on country roads and also ride off-road. Because especially in this off-road oriented rider bubble, the 450 MT is very popular because it can do quite a lot. For example, long suspension travel, grown-up ergonomics. It's not only made for beginners, adjustable suspension, and all that at a really attractive price. Especially in Germany, 6,500 for the package. I understand why it's so popular. For me personally, I think I'd put it in A tier. And why only A tier? So in A rank, let's stick with German terms for now. The CFMOTO 450 MT is a cool thing because it has a very good cost to benefit ratio. It can genuinely do a lot. Also a killer sound. How that's Euro 5 plus compliant, I don't know, but I don't care either. It sounds properly brilliant, mostly works very well too. No wonder this bike, for example, sells like hotcakes in Italy or Spain. So there aren't even any press bikes left because they're all simply gone. But why not S tier? Why not the highest rank? There are still a few points where the Chinese haven't quite reached the highest level of refinement. For example, the initial throttle response is quite jerky because you get those on-off transitions. And generally, it's a motor that sounds mighty, but you do need quite a lot of revs for it to really get going. And on an enduro, I prefer a bit more of that tractor character. But as I said, that really is a matter of taste. It's more that you notice in a few corners that the final polish isn't 100% there yet, but it's already right up there towards the front, and the sales figures say the same. Let's not get bogged down. Next motorcycle. Also, something that's been on the market for a long time, the Honda CRF 300 Rally. Again, it's more in the conversation for this off-road bubble. It's often also chosen by people who say they want their first experience on gravel, on loose surfaces. Then lots of people buy this CRF 300 Rally because it's one of the lightest machines in this A2 segment. We're talking 153 kilograms, according to the manufacturer, ready to ride. Hey, that's a statement. Sure, we've also only got 286 cubic centimeters from a single cylinder, which means only 27 horsepower. That's the biggest reservation I've got with it. Off-road, no question. If you're not some big off-road hero, that's enough to chug along on the trails and tracks of this world. You just can't be in a hurry. But on the road, especially in our countries where you're doing 100 kilometers an hour or clearly above that at times, it gets difficult with 27 horsepower. That's why, for me, and on top of that, it's relatively expensive. It costs around 7,800 to 7,900 euros in Germany and Austria. That's a lot of money for a relatively low level of performance. And beyond that, it isn't overflowing with features either. So it's simply a lot of money. But it can be worth it if you say, right, I don't need much power. I want an accessible bike for my first off-road experiences. Then you also won't mind that the suspension is on the very soft side. So overall, not a bad thing, the Honda CRF 300, but I see it in B tier because over the years, with competition increasing, it's got a much harder time in this comparison. And because of that, it maybe falls behind a bit, and in my view, can't really be placed at the very top of the segment anymore. Let's move on to an A2 travel enduro that I think was among the most hotly anticipated, the KTM 390 Adventure R. I think it was highly awaited because, unlike other motorcycles in this segment that often try to cover multiple bases, it should be suitable for beginners. It should be able to do a bit off-road. It should also be fun on the road and so on. KTM simply said, right, we're making no compromises. With the Adventure R, we go as far as possible towards off-road. Yeah, as far as possible. Compromise-free was in the marketing slogan. In reality, it's not quite like that. For example, they stuck to the A2 rule. 0.2 kilowatts per kilogram. That means they couldn't make it much lighter, even though people would like that. I think you often hear in the off-road community, hey, I'd love a small travel enduro that makes 50 horsepower, but only weighs 140 to 150 kilograms. But that doesn't work because of the A2 rules, and the 390 Adventure R sticks to them too. So after it was presented, you heard quite often, hey, it's still too heavy, or the ratio of power to weight doesn't fit. I don't think that's a problem. I think with its very long suspension travel of 230 millimeters, a ready-to-ride weight of around 180 kilograms, and an ergonomics package that's genuinely great for riding standing up, it's properly well thought out and could be a really interesting little machine for off-road enthusiasts. But, unfortunately, the compromise-free thing stayed in the marketing slogan. With most components, it was, I'd say, still chosen quite carefully. For example, the suspension, genuinely capable. But what about the engine? The engine was taken over one-to-one from the 390 Duke, is extremely rev-hungry, down low it feels like it's about to stall, and it stalls very quickly too. That was also a problem, and the reason there was a recall, so maybe it's better now. I wrote it before the recall. But I don't think the basic character of the engine has changed, and that character is you have to be in the upper third of the rev range, otherwise not much happens. And I just think that's a shame, because in my view, it doesn't suit an enduro that well, and it's not especially beginner-friendly either. It helps if, even at only a third throttle, you've got enough torque to just carry yourself over obstacles. So the KTM 390 Adventure, I personally had the highest expectations for it, but for me it's only B tier. Only rank B for me because the engine is central, it has to fit and feel good, and unfortunately that just wasn't the case. And then there were little things on top, like the brake not being particularly fade resistant as we saw at the Nassfeld Pass. B rank. B rank. Solid midfield, I'd say, with potential to move up. Then maybe we should talk straight away about the KTM 390 Enduro R, because that follows the same principle, but a bit differently. Dual sport. Sure, you dial your expectations back a bit for touring. In return, expectations might rise towards either road cornering, performance, or off-road riding. It's noticeably lighter again. Properly, a good 10 kilograms. And there, I think the A2 rule bites even harder because I believe there would simply be a lot more in it if you didn't have to stick to that A2 rule. As it is, it's still quite a heavy motorcycle for what a dual sport machine could actually be, especially if you think back to the earlier days. And it suffers from the same Duke engine, so to speak, as the Adventure R. And accordingly, having ridden both, I also think it doesn't offer so much extra cornering or off-road performance that it would make up for the loss of things like wind protection and a bit of touring comfort. That's why I have to put the 390 Enduro R into C rank. Still not a bad bike, and you can definitely have fun with it. But for me, the overall package or the equation under these A2 rules, works the least well here. And while we're on the 390 Enduro R, let's talk about the main competition that was also introduced fresh last year, the Suzuki DR-Z4S. I went all the way to Oregon in the USA for the first presentation. We rode the most brutal trails you can imagine. If you're an off-road enthusiast in America, they build rather different trails, and off-road riding is still approved of there. So it was the perfect environment to test the DR-Z4S, and the riding was great, but at the same time the DR-Z is an ambivalent vehicle. First, it also suffers somewhat under the A2 regulation. You can moan about it, but at some point you just have to accept it. That's how it is. The comparison with the old DR-Z400 models is merciless because they had more power and at the same time were lighter than the modern product. But the rule is the rule. What I criticize more strongly is, for example, that even though so much time has passed, they insisted on a 5-speed gearbox. That's the only bike among these 10 that still relies on a 5-speed gearbox. A 6-speed would have massively increased the road, long-distance touring usability and possibilities. Because as it is, you're quite limited in speed. Yes, the gearing was chosen longer, but then again, you don't have that punch on the trails. Up top, you're missing top speed. It just isn't ideal, especially when you look at the price. That was discussion point number one anyway. 9,990 euros for a 38 horsepower motorcycle without big features and without touring comfort to speak of is quite something. By now, yes, the price has already been lowered via promotions and so on to well under 9,000 euros, but still, that's a hefty chunk of money. In Germany too, 9,700 for it. And I know it also didn't sell particularly well, and I think that's mainly down to the price to performance ratio. That's why, even though in contrast to KTM, the Suzuki's engine is, in my view, a model example of how an engine should feel in an enduro. Really nice, tractor-like, fat and torquey. You can feel there's a bit of flywheel mass behind it. It doesn't cut out when things go wrong, and you're just about saving yourself over an obstacle with a touch of throttle. That works well. At the same time, the suspension is exceptionally good at responding, good ergonomics. It's properly put together, this motorcycle. It's just that the gearbox and the price don't quite fit for me. That's why I'll be generous, and I think I'll give it rank B for the bike itself and how it rides. But because of the price, I again have the urge to put it into C rank. But I'll be generous for now, simply because I also associate it with that nice memory of the trails. Let's leave it in B rank. But only just. Right now, we move a bit away from off-road riding and come to a road-oriented Honda NX500, until recently still known as the CB 500X, now newly renamed and revised. But in principle, it's still a really road-oriented motorcycle. We've still got a pure twin cylinder on board. By the way, most on this list do. We've only got 5 single cylinders. The 2 KTMs, the Honda CRF 300 Rally, the Royal Enfield Himalayan, which we'll talk about, and the Suzuki DR-Z4S. All the others have a pure twin cylinder, and the pure twin cylinder in the NX500 is a really nicely versatile unit. Not too rev hungry, but also with torque coming in nicely down low, more in the middle already. It feels correspondingly solid. It's also got almost 43 Newton meters, the highest torque, shared with another bike we'll talk about. At the same time, it's a bit heavier at 196 kilograms. On asphalt, that doesn't make much difference. 19-inch front wheel, relatively short suspension travel of 135. So yes, on road with maybe the option of a light gravel road, but because of that, it works well. The suspension responds nicely. We now also have a twin disc brake up front. Back when I did my first big motorbike tour to Norway on the CB500X, I already wished for a bit more braking performance. That wish has been granted. And for people who say off-road doesn't interest me at all, I just want an A2 touring machine. The NX500 is absolutely a recommendation from me. It does everything right. Proven Honda quality. There's also grown-up accessories for this bike. Proper large cases and luggage systems, which is not a given in this A2 class, because manufacturers sometimes seem to feel, well, beginners who ride these don't need a properly usable luggage system or anything. That always annoys me. The small bikes deserve decent accessory options too. For me, the Honda NX500 is definitely A rank. Even with the road-oriented focus, it works exceptionally well. And now we come to the Royal Enfield Himalayan. That's been around for ages too, though for a long time with the 411 single cylinder, meaning clearly less horsepower than the 40 we now have. Also, 40 Newton meters of torque. And if anyone has seen the test videos on it in the past, I'm a big fan of the Himalayan. I'm a big fan because first, the engine is brilliant. One of the single-cylinder engines that doesn't need endless revs, but is a proper tractor. A proper mule that just pulls you along with nice thumping drive. But at the same time, the performance is now at a level where you can have fun with it. You can also go briskly through some twisties. You can more easily, for example, play a bit with traction on gravel, break the rear loose, do little drifts. With 40 horsepower, that's simply a lot easier now. Then the second big plus point, the suspension isn't adjustable, but it works very well, really good. At least for my weight of around 75 kilograms and for my riding style. It fits very, very well, very predictable, very capable. 200 millimeters of travel, you can do something with that. Also proper travel enduro wheel sizes with 21 inches at the front and 18 at the rear. The biggest criticism was more the weight. It comes in at around 200 kilograms. We measured it at 200.5 fully fueled. It's also got a big tank, to be fair, 21 liters if I'm not mistaken, but it's still basically almost as heavy as a Yamaha Tenere, which has 73 horsepower. But I don't find that so tragic on the Himalayan. Because unlike some other A2 travel enduros that want to look like big travel enduros in terms of appearance and geometry, like the 450 MT, for example, which is built quite tall, the Himalayan doesn't do that. It has more of this retro style and also a cockpit that doesn't rise particularly high. Everything sits low, and because of that, it's very manageable. The seat height too, which varies between 8.25 and 8.45, is very accessible for this class. And accordingly, the Himalayan in motion and in real life feels less sluggish than you might imagine from the numbers on paper. So for me, it's not such a drama that it weighs a lot, and I've also done long tours on it, and I simply don't really have anything to complain about. At the same time, this Enfield is built with a bit of that it'll take it toughness. Sure, you could criticize that the gear lever is basically just a bit of sheet metal, but at the same time, I've caught it on something before, and then you just bend it back by hand like normal. Some aluminium cast piece that others fit. Once that breaks, that's it. So overall, I find the Himalayan extremely likable, and at the same time, I've got nothing really to fault. That's why S rank. I'll just throw that out there. But feel free to disagree with me. I want to hear your opinions down in the comments. Now let's move on to an exotic one. A total exotic one that was on tour with us last year when we tested the KTM 390 Adventure R for the first time, and we're also out with the Himalayan. And that is the Brixton Crossfire 500 Storr. You probably don't know it, or maybe some of you don't know it at all. Brixton is an Austrian brand from KSR, a big importer for other motorbike brands too. And for a long time, Brixton mainly had small capacity retro models. Then at some point, they developed their first liquid-cooled pure twin-cylinder engine. And that powers this Crossfire 500 Storr too. It's Brixton's first travel enduro, and accordingly, I'd say it's not a bad first attempt, but it still has some areas for optimization, zones where you should still refine a bit, because on the one hand, the Brixton is quite heavy at 209 kilograms ready to ride, clearly heavier than most of the others in this class. It has 47.6 horsepower, so the power to weight ratio isn't ideal, and at the same time, this pure twin cylinder needs really high revs. You're basically pinned at the throttle, wide open, and even then on a mountain pass, for example, it doesn't make that much progress. It's definitely more on the road-oriented side. That means a 19-inch front wheel. It worked well, the road riding too, when you finally get some momentum and let it glide through the bends. The suspension for me was surprisingly high quality. It really did feel good. Also, in combination with the road-oriented tire sizes, a slightly wider tire, a planted feel when leaned over. It felt quite confident and confidence-inspiring. Downsides were more things like braking, which went soft quite quickly when we rode down the pass. I've already mentioned the high weight, also the display, how some of it worked with adjustment or showing certain items. Not quite at the level of the big established manufacturers, but again, not a bad first go. So to keep it short, where do we place it? I'm being a bit ruthless. As I said, it's not a bad first effort, but I'm putting it in C rank, with a tendency upwards if they sharpen up those points. As it is now, I'd say lower midfield. Right, and now we come to the newest A2 travel enduros. I rode the Kawasaki KLE 500 in the SE variant at the first presentation. The SE variant is simply better equipped. Proper skid plate, hand guards, its own colors, LED light elements, TFT display, that sort of thing. For riding, definitely necessary, especially if you head into loose terrain. But the big question with the KLE is mainly ground clearance. There were also big discussions beforehand because it only has 185 millimeters of ground clearance. That's only 5 millimeters more than the road-oriented Honda NX 500, for example, and clearly less than the other especially off-road oriented A2 travel enduros here have. AKTM, for example, has 272 millimeters, almost 10 centimeters more than the Kawasaki. Was that a problem then? We rode fairly easy to medium easy terrain at the first presentation and also a lot of road. And I have to say, the KLE is a very, very rounded overall package. I just don't know why they pushed it so hard in marketing towards off-road riding, dirt spraying, life's a rally, ride it was the motto. Why they forced it so much in that direction, because that's simply not what the bike is. The KLE is a very, I think, well-executed motorcycle. Kawasaki also hasn't really had a proper travel enduro for a long time. Now we've got a proper 21-inch front wheel, 210 millimeters of travel at the front, 196 at the rear. So it's good. The engine does need a bit of revs to make power, but it still feels fairly confident down low. Handling is nicely agile, ergonomics are good. It's a rounded package, but not a hardcore off-road machine. The ground clearance already tells you that, the position of the air filter tells you that, and also the biggest weakness, a really odd rear wheel size of 140, 70, 17. There simply aren't any, I'm not even talking serious off-road tires, but even slightly knobbly tires don't exist for that size. At best, you get those 90-10 tires that, for me, are basically road tires with a cool off-road look and nothing more. And that's just an unnecessary limitation, because you could have had more choice if you actually wanted to go towards off-road. As it stands, the KLE for me is a Honda NX500 with a bit more off-road ability, or simply longer suspension travel and a larger wheel so it can smooth out bad tracks more nicely. And because of that, I'd see it in rank B. I'd see it in rank B because, for me, it's a bit too inconsistent in what it actually wants to be. It tries to do multiple things, and I always prefer it when manufacturers have the courage to say, we're making it like this for this niche, and that's why it's a properly brilliant bit of kit. And speaking of properly brilliant kit, we come to the last bike, the BMW F 450 GS. And here I have to say, nobody has ridden it yet. The presentation is in 2 weeks on Sicily. Niels and Bernd Hiemer, former Supermoto world champion, will be there and will put it through its paces. But I wanted to include it anyway because it's the new A2 travel enduro this year. And this is more like, what do I expect? Because the key figures are extremely exciting. One, BMW GS is the dominant player for us in the big configuration. How well can a GS score now in the A2 segment, especially with so much competition? The engine, completely its own thing, a pure twin cylinder, but with a unique 130-degree crankpin offset, 48 horsepower, sorry, but it'll be really interesting how that feels to ride. Then another novelty. They have the easy clutch, so a further developed automatic clutch system that's meant to bring a comfort gain and easy handling by making it possible not to have to operate the clutch lever all the time while still keeping the riding dynamics like a typical motorcycle. How well that works in reality, I'm really curious. But I just think it's cool that technical innovation is being done for the A2 class first, and not as some trickle-down effect that at some point drips down from the higher capacity classes into the A2 class years later. So nice one, BMW. I think that kind of courage deserves to be rewarded. And beyond that, again, exciting, quite a lot of electronics for an A2 motorbike. And then, yeah, I also find it hard to place it. The press material, again, went towards off-road, but at the same time, the suspension travel isn't overly long at 180 millimeters. And above all, we have GS, typically you could say a 19-inch front wheel. That means it's more road-oriented again. It'll be really interesting. I have very high expectations simply because it's a BMW GS. You come at it with high expectations. At the same time, for my taste, I'd have liked a 21-inch front wheel if you're already making such a song and dance about technology and also about the performance ratio. It pushes the A2 class to the limit, and at the same time, the 450 GS is supposed to weigh only 178 kilograms ready to ride. That would be pretty good, and accordingly, it's a shame that they still stick with the more road-oriented dimensions, but maybe it works insanely well. I expect at least an A rank, and maybe I'll be surprised. I hope I'll be surprised, and it'll be an S rank. Yeah, and with that, you've now got my ranking of the current A2 travel enduros and the dual sports mixed in between two. Do you agree with me or not? Your opinion down in the comments. And with that, this fake comparison has ended up longer than I thought. If you found that interesting, then give me a thumbs up. Also, feel free to write in the comments whether you like this kind of couch chat from the casting couch here, or whether we should really rather stay outdoors in the wilderness on the motorbike. Though, as I said, the comparison and the tests are still coming. But for now, I'll say thanks for watching. Until next time, take care and bye.